Hello, students. I'm going to be going over the early republic today. If you haven't already, please check out the lectures that I've uploaded on the Roman kingdom period and the monarchy, and just a little bit about pre-Roman Italy as well, and the Etruscans. So check that out. We're going to be talking about the civilization of ancient Rome today and the early republic, which the dates for that time period are 509 to 287 BCE. So my sources for this lecture, secondary, the Western Civilization Beyond Boundaries textbook, volume 1 to 1715. Now, the authors of this textbook are Noble, Strauss, Osheim, Noschel, Campo, Roberts, and Cohen. So this is the official textbook that we use for Western Civilization 1 in the course that I teach currently for the 2020 year. Now, another textbook, sort of the unofficial textbook, is Western Civilizations. This is the volume 1 of the textbook that I use for when I teach Western Civilization 2 many times. So one thing I also draw from and have available and make available to my students, Foundations of Civilization. This is an audiobook done by one of the authors of the official textbook, and it is called Foundations of Civilization. It follows the same themes as in Beyond Boundary, but there are differences, and I do enjoy comparing the two sources. Thomas F.X. Noble, he's one of the authors of Beyond Boundary. He is the lecturer for this audiobook, and this audiobook has been made available through the Great Courses. So some primary sources: Polybius. He is a Greek soldier, aristocrat, historian, and he is a prisoner of war in Rome who writes about and celebrates the achievements of the Roman Republic. And he spends a total of 14 years in Rome and recounts, and he's during the Middle Republic, but he is recounting some of their history and tells us some of the themes that are present by the time period of the Middle Republic. Virgil, he is a historian who is commissioned by Caesar Augustus, so he's from the Empire period, but he tells about the Rome's rise to glory in a manner done similar to that of Homer's epic poetry. So Polybius, a Greek source, Virgil, a Roman source. Those are two primary sources that have been consulted for some of the information that's put together to make this composite lecture. So again, the early republic's 509 to 287. Now, scholars envision a longer process than the single dramatic event, which dramatically upends the monarchy. Now, perhaps that is how things really happened. But again, scholars and historians believe that there was a longer period of time in which the monarchy transitioned into the republic. So over time, all the diverse tribes on the peninsula will eventually meld together and become one single community of Romans. Now, the republic would be different from the monarchy in a few ways. One, that it stands for liberty, and two, that it's a commonwealth, okay? So the republic is this public affair, whereas monarchy, the preceding monarchy, was a private affair. Now, I'll go more into that in a moment. The early republic also is a time of great social and political chaos, conflict. Okay, as we will discuss in more detail through the struggle of the orders. Now, the Romans trace the founding of their republic to the overthrow of their last king and the establishment of a unique form of constitutional government, okay, in which the aristocracy, which is embodied by the Senate in Rome, was checked by executive rule of 2 elected consuls. So not one king, 2 consuls, and then you have the collective people. Okay, so the Roman people were proud of their unique republic that they had come up with, of their unique history that they had possibly come up with, and especially the legend that they had overthrown their kings in this dramatic event. As I mentioned earlier, that was probably a longer process than a single dramatic event. The Romans clung to sort of this story that they were a republic even after individuals came to wield kingly powers, especially Julius Caesar and his heir Caesar Augustus Octavian, as we will discuss in later lectures. Romans identify Roman religion, identity, and politics were all sort of bound up in the worship of their ancestors, especially male ancestors. Towards the tail end of this conversation, I'm really going to go into detail on that. As a result, the fathers, living and dead, exerted extraordinary power in early Roman society, and we'll talk about that setup again in great detail in a moment. Now, Roman women did enjoy more freedoms than women in ancient Greece, but were subject to the authority of their male relatives in every way. And another thing is the Romans, they were influenced greatly by the Greeks, okay? But they, while they regarded them in many ways as superior, they also regarded them as dangerous, and they would go on to eventually conquer their Greek neighbors. Now, even as Rome and the Romans became to grow into an increasingly urbanized society, they would celebrate their farming heritage, even as they turned into an urbanized society. The Roman army had unprecedented strength and importance in the civilization, but the army's relationship to Roman politics and society changed throughout the Republic as Rome is growing into an empire. And eventually, Rome will unite the Mediterranean world and most of Western Asia, all the preceding cultures and cultural phenomenon that we've discussed from the Mediterranean world and in the Middle East. And Rome will now unite Western Asian culture with all of these European aspects of culture, and it's going to be a truly unique thing. So Rome would eventually unite the Mediterranean world as most of Western Asia, while embracing provinces that are now parts of the following places: France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, and the Balkan states. So through these efforts, Rome builds this historical arc that joined Europe to the heritage of places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. Okay. Now, the Republic is the second of the 3 major periods that we're going to discuss over Roman history. Okay, so now remember, it's the Kingdom, Republic, and Empire. The Kingdom period we've covered, and it comes to an end in 509 BCE. Now, the Republic is divided into 3 periods: early, middle, and late. We're discussing the early today, 509 to 287 BCE, a period of much social and political conflict and a major struggle between social orders. The Middle Republic is the first well-documented period we have to draw from. It's not, there's not as much strife domestically, and there is massive Roman expansion abroad. Again, that's 287 to 183 BCE. The late Republic, this is 133 to 31 BCE. And the strife of this period gives way to the empire. The empire would stretch from the North Atlantic to the Persian Gulf at its height. So the founding of the Republic, let's get into this real quick. The Latin Rite, this was a trading pact and provisions for intermarriage, and the migratio, Latin word, which allowed a resident of one settlement to immigrate. Migratio, derivative of immigration, to an it allowed a resident of one settlement to immigrate to another, and after a year's residence to have full rights as a citizen there. So Rome has a willingness to extend the Latin Rite to colonies far beyond Latium, and that is a key factor in the future success of the empire and as the Republic expands and grows. So according to legend, the Roman kings are overthrown in 509 BCE. Now, again, this likely takes place over a longer period in a different way than later historians recounted. The story of the rape of Lucretia, that serves as both a patriotic myth and a statement about the foundation of the Republic and Roman attitudes towards female chastity and family honor. So this story of the rape of Lucretia coincided with a very radical change in governance, right? Cleisthenes, if you recall, in the Greek tradition, is credited with the advent of democracy in Athens in 508 BCE. It's believed by some scholars that the date of overthrowing the Tarquins and this date being 1 year apart are too coincidental, right? That Romans may have altered history in an attempt to appear to be superior to the Greeks in matters of democracy. Many of the accounts we have been discussing and have seen are legend, myth, and historical fiction. So there is a lot of territorial expansion during the Roman Republic. The early Roman Republic was a time marked by near constant warfare. This is a time when Romans aimed to stitch together a patchwork of valuable territories that could support this growing population. So the Romans had acquired this port city at Ostia. This is the mouth of the Tiber River. It's only 20 miles from Rome. But then they also pushed northward against the Etruscan territory there, and then south into Naples, where another good port was also located. By 300 BCE, the Romans had either absorbed or allied themselves with all of central Italy, and then began to set their eyes on the wealthy Greek colonies of Sicily. And in this push for territorial expansion, the Romans did not impose this heavy burden of taxation. That is very notable. But rather, what they wanted was the allies to contribute soldiers to fight in the Roman army. Rome would extend the Latin Rite to many of the peoples and territories that they conquered. And the Romans also began to give its soldiers regular pay and distribution of conquered lands, which improved morale. One thing that led to their success as well was the Romans showed a willingness to utilize foreign military technology. All right, and I'll mention a little bit more about that as we move on. But one theory that Rome's used many times to justify their continued conquest throughout the Republic was this theory of expanding defense. This was this idea that they may be attacked in the future, and that is why they would have to attack, is out of this perceived threat or this future threat or this growing threat, and this was their justification for conquest. And slowly but surely, Rome began to conquer the entire Italian peninsula and then grow outward from Italy. Now, some remarks on the Roman military and the legion. Obviously, if they're expanding, they're going to have a strong military. Now, the Roman legion is 5,000 men. Rome begins really building up the legions during the early Republic and is very good at organizing all of its military resources. The legions fought vigorously against the Etruscans, and after their expulsion from the monarchy, they are eventually defeated entirely by the Roman legions. The Romans engaged in a stalemate with the Etruscans across the Tiber at the city of Veii. And in 392 BCE, the Romans are able to breach the city, gain a great victory, which would ultimately allow their continued expansion through Italy. Now, the Romans originally had borrowed the Greeks in their deployment of the phalanx. They had borrowed that tradition in warfare, and this is around the 6th century. We talked about the phalanx being used in the kingdom period previously. Now, the phalanx suited Rome well on level ground, but it was a poor strategy and rugged and mountainous fighting conditions, which they encountered in central Italy, and they would encounter beyond in their conquests. The Roman legion's very flexible. It's very adaptable. Okay, 5,000 men were divided into maniples, which means handfuls, which was a group of about 120 men. These men would train together on specialized tasks and maybe even use specialized weaponry. The maniples were subdivided into 60 centuries, meaning hundreds. The number of men per century varied. Each century was commanded by a centurion. So the semi-independence of these fighting units and having its own commander created a more maneuverable army than that of a single phalanx. And it's also better suited for mountain fighting. Now, the Roman legion goes into battle divided into 3 lines. If one line failed, 2 more lines were there to support. So unlike the hoplites, who engaged the enemy at short range, legionnaires first threw their javelins at long range. Then, having broken the enemy's order, they charged and fought with sword and shield. So that is a few remarks on the Roman military during the early Republic. Now, the Constitution in the early Republic. When the Republic is established, Rome's population is around 130,000 people. Now, society is divided into 2 main groups, which we'll talk about in great detail: the Patricians and the Plebeians. Now, the Patricians come from families who traced their roots back to the original 100 senators that had been chosen by Romulus during the kingdom period. Patricians would dominate the government of the early Republic. Now, the plebeians, these were people who could not trace their lineage, and they were the largest group of society. This is most of the people in Rome. The patricians were numerically smaller than the plebeians, and in many ways, the early Republic, because of the patrician dominance, is an oligarchy of wealthy, aristocratic patrician families that are guiding and shaping and manipulating Roman politics. Women, slaves, immigrants denied almost all political rights. Like the plebeians, they were disproportionately ruled by the oligarchical, senatorial, patrician elite. A majority of Romans were settled farmers. Farms produced food for consumption of crops and for trade. Typically, you would see olives and grapes. At the dawn of the early republic, Rome is comprised of about 500 square miles of territory. But this increases to 2,000 square miles by 338 BCE, and by 256 BCE, the Romans control the entire peninsula, about 50,000 square miles. After they overthrow the Tarquins, the Romans officially declared the affairs of Rome belonged to the people. That would be the citizens of Rome who would vote. So Rome would be a public affair, or a respublica, a republic. Government would no longer be the business of a king. Rome would now be governed by laws, which would come later, and elected officials. Now, there are three branches of Roman government, the executive, deliberative, and legislative branches. The Senate was headed by two elected officers called consuls. They were supposedly chosen by all citizens, but were inevitably members of the aristocratic families known as the Patricians. And it's Polybius who gives us our three divisions of the Roman political institutions in his writings. Now, the executive branch, the executive branch of elected magistrates, which had to campaign and have money and connections if they hope to hold office. This would be time-consuming and unpaid. And this meant only that the wealthy or idly wealthy could afford to hold types of public office. So the Senate was headed by two chief magistrates, consuls, as we mentioned a second ago. These men are elected annually and would serve only 1 year apiece. Each had the power to issue commands, order punishments, executions. And this is where we see the combined power of the executive and judicial functions of government. Okay. Each consul had the power to veto the other. If this led to a stalemate, the Senate would be the arbiter. And the Roman Senate would guide and advise the consuls. And the senators elected new consuls each year. Consuls exercised essentially all the same power as a king had done previously in Roman society. They dealt with justice, making law, and commanding the army. Other offices were created to assist the consuls in their administrative activities between 500 and 300 BCE. Two censors, CENSORS, were elected for 18-month terms. They supervised the census, the military registry of citizens. Later, they became known as supervisors of public morals and would punish bad citizens. In times of great emergency, power would be turned over to a single magistrate called a dictator. We'll talk about a specific instance when that happens in the Republic. This individual would serve a 6-month term and no longer. Praetors presided in court cases between citizens. Quaestors managed the treasury and distributed payment to soldiers and state finances. Aediles would be in charge of food, games, and infrastructure, and the overall state of the city. All right. So those are remarks on the executive branch. Now, the deliberative branch would be the Roman Senate. Okay. Now, this is a group of 300 at this time. Patres were fathers, and these people were also patricians. And at the onset of the early republic, there were 136 patrician families. Now, these are like the Eupatrids, or the well-fathered people in Greece. These are an older group of distinguished and responsible citizens. The Senate also has its roots and foundations in the Roman kingdom period, if you recall, it being an institution that existed during the time of the first Roman king, Romulus. The Latin word senex translates to old man, and the Senate was a group of old men. Each senator had been a former magistrate and would serve a life term. These individuals had great authority and power. They supervised public spending and foreign policy. And the patricians that were occupying the Senate were the elite class in Roman society. They controlled important priesthoods and had many supporters in the military. Within a generation of the establishment of the Republic, patrician dominance of the government began to be challenged by the plebeians, or the plebs, or just the people, is a translation. And that would serve as a stage for a century-long struggle and conflict known as the Struggle of the Orders. Now, the plebeian classes made up roughly 98% of the Roman population and were very diverse as a group. Some plebeians had grown wealthy through trade, maybe also agriculture, and most were small land-holding farmers, artisans, or urban members of the urban poor. These individuals would at times be forced to serve in the army, but they could not hold political office and were victims of discriminatory decisions in civil trials, which were judged exclusively by the patricians. The plebeians didn't even know what their legal rights were supposed to be because Rome had yet to establish a real system of law that was accessible to the masses. The plebeians are also threatened with debt slavery. Now let's make some remarks on the legislative branch. This would be the assembly. There was an assembly of all citizens that would take legislative initiative. Any measure taken by the legislative assembly had to be approved by the Roman Senate. There were 4 total assemblies: the Curiate, the Centuriate, the Council of the Plebs, and the Tribal Assembly. All decisions were made by majority vote after speeches or campaigning had taken place. And assembly meetings were preceded by public meetings, which contained debates. The Curiate Assembly, this was the assembly of the monarchy. This had survived and was held over into the Republic. The Centuriate Assembly, this was the assembly that held the real power. It elected magistrates, voted on laws and treaties, accepted declarations of war and peace, acted as a court in cases of treason, homicide, and appeals of the magistrates' decisions. This assembly was dominated by wealthy men who came from the class known as the equestrians, or the cavalrymen. This is a new social order that emerges and becomes very prominent and influential in the early Republic, and they owned and equipped war horses for Rome's cavalry. Now, the Council of the Plebs, this is the plebeian effort to organize themselves as a state within a state. This is created in 471 BCE. They elected their own officials, known as tribunes. The plebs elected 10 tribunes annually. The tribunes vetoed acts of the magistrates which might negatively impact the plebeians. The decisions of the plebeians were binding only in their order. They could not pass laws that were binding on the patricians. The tribal assembly. This assembly used a system of representation that heavily favored landowners, such as commonly at the time patricians were. They elected lower magistrates, and like the Centurion Assembly, voted on laws and acted as a court of appeals. The tribal assembly eventually replaces the council of the plebs. Let's discuss the two social orders and the struggle of the orders and the struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. The plebeians, or the plebs, this group made up the masses of Roman society. These were ordinary people: peasants, farmers, craftsmen, artisans, shopkeepers, and some were wealthy, but none had access to political office, right, in Rome. That was an issue for many, and some had aspirations to hold political office. The patricians exerted rule over the plebeians, and this distinction had been built into the system on purpose. This is an element of control and an element of hierarchy, which shows the difference in equality between these two orders, the patricians and the plebeians. Some things that ordinary plebeians wanted was debt relief, redistribution of land, and the publication of written laws. The plebeians made up the backbone of the Roman army in the early Republic, and throughout the Republic, they were asked to go off and fight and die, but they didn't really have any political rights as Roman citizens. And as I mentioned, rich plebeians did want to hold office. So eventually, and several times, Roman plebeians secede from the Roman state until their concessions were made to them. The plebeians were needed for Roman expansion and defense of the city and of Rome, entire peninsula, depending on when you're talking about. And the plebeians would often just withdraw to Aventine Hill until their grievances were addressed and their issues had been solved. This again happened a few times. This results in ultimately the patricians allowing the plebeians to elect tribunes or tribal leaders. The job of the tribune was to protect his constituents from patrician injustice. And the plebeians would guarantee the safety of these officers by vowing to kill any person who hindered them from exercising their powers. This plebeian victory led to the codification of the law of the around 450 BCE, which is a major breakthrough. So in 449 BCE, the publication of the law, known as the 12 Tables, takes place, with the bronze tablets being posted in the Roman Forum. Some sources say the original tablets were wooden. It's a very tough and primitive code, but it was accessible and dependable. Law begins becoming a prestigious profession in Rome, and in the Middle and Late Republic will be very notable. If you look into Cicero, it would be a great example of how important law had become. We'll talk about that when we get to that time period. Some plebeians gradually gained access to the Senate. That was a major breakthrough. In 445 BCE, the patricians began accepting intermarriage with the plebeians. In 367 BCE, the patricians agreed to plebeian consuls. That same year saw a debt relief law, and further debt relief came in 326 BCE, a few years later. By 287 BCE, the Patrician and Plebeian orders merged, and a law called the Lex Hortensia made decisions of the Council of the Plebeians and the Tribal Assembly binding on the entire community, Patricians and Plebeians alike. Debt relief, access to published laws, increased power for their assembly, and protection from arbitrary power was something that most non-elite Romans were able to bring about by the end of the early Republic. This time period, and something you will see emblazoned on many buildings, is SPQR, the Roman Senate and People, Senatus Populusque Romanus. This was the ancient world's first known representational form of government. We see the early republic has elements mixed from many different theories of government administration. The consuls or the chief magistrates is a monarchical form of rule. Aristocratic rule can be seen through the Senate, and also the magistrates and the assemblies are an example of democracy. Now, a few remarks on Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, or just Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus embodies the classic Roman virtues. He's a legendary citizen, he's a statesman farmer, he's a Roman hero who reluctantly accepts an appointment as dictator. And he is also seen as the paragon of Roman heroism in the early Republic. So Cincinnatus worked his own fields as a farmer. He was doing this activity when a delegation of senators arrives to bring him news of Rome being attacked in 458 BCE. Rome called for the appointment of Cincinnatus as dictator. Now, this would only last 6 months. At this time, the term dictator didn't have a negative connotation that it does today. Now, Cincinnatus wins a quick victory, returned to the city immediately, resigned, and returned to his farm and continued working. So he abandoned the office of dictator 15 days after accepting it. To the Romans, Cincinnatus was the paradigm of manly virtue, who's willing to lead when called upon and when necessary, but preferred the simple life of farming and plowing his fields. Now, in 386 BCE, the Celts from Gaul, or present-day France, appear on the Italian side of the Alps. They were a warlike people. They had been pushed out of their own territory and are trying to settle in Italy. Now, Rome dominated central Italy, and they asked the Romans for territory, but were refused by the Romans. Then the Gauls descend on the Romans with absolute fury. Now, the Romans saw these people as absolute savages due to their wartime strategies and atrocities that they committed. Rome barricades behind the city walls, but Rome is eventually sacked. Romans escape slaughter by paying the Gauls off, and they eventually leave in peace, as the story goes. The Roman army is involved in constant war throughout the last 100 years of the early Republic. The Romans entered into a treaty of alliance with those they conquered, and this would provide the Roman legion with the endless supply of new recruits they would need to keep expanding. Now, I'm going to make several remarks on the Roman family and the importance of the Roman family as a basic unit of Roman society and a model of political authority. The Roman family is seen as the essence of Roman identity. The word familia has a very broad connotation, a bit broader than the word family in English. Familia could be better translated as household. It would connote slaves, animals, property, as well as members of the nuclear family and their ancestors or descendants. And the Roman family was an authoritarian institution, which was governed by a male, making the familia an example of a patriarchy. The legal head of the familia was the paterfamilias, the oldest living male, usually the father. Roman respect for the paterfamilias stemmed from their esteem for their ancestors. Maiorum, Maiorum, was a prevailing principle behind Roman institutions. This was the code of elders, or the custom of the ancestors. Now, the Latin word morality is derived from mos morium. The code was essential to Roman identity, which was rooted in this ancestor worship. The Latin word pietas, meaning piety, which would be a reference to reverence for family traditions and for one's fathers, living and deceased. Now, an extraordinary maximum that was upheld by the 12 tables was the patria potestas, or fatherly power. A Roman father, no matter what his social class was, had absolute authority within his household, including the power of life or death. If the father was too poor to raise a child, he could expose it or sell it into slavery. If he was dishonored by his wife or child, he could kill them with zero consequences. Fathers would also arrange their daughter's marriage and provide her with a dowry, if they were able. Roman women never became legally independent, even on the death of their paterfamilias. And the Roman equation of religion with family meant that all gods were essentially family gods of the Roman state. The Republic was essentially a giant, timeless household run by elders, senators, and father figures, Patricians, some of whom trace their ancestry all the way back to the gods. If you look into the mythology behind Aeneas and some of the mythological ancestry in relation to Rome, the mother of Aeneas was Venus, for example. Ancestral duty is also reflected in Roman naming practices. A free-born Roman would have at least two names. The most important name would be that of his early ancestor. All patricians and some plebeians belonged to a gens, a kinship group that traced its ancestry back to a purported common ancestor. All Roman males had a personal and family name, and patricians and elite plebeians had that third or middle name, which was their gens. Gaius Julius Caesar, he entered public life as Julius, a member of the family of Julii, who claimed ancestry to Iulius, the son of Aeneas. So that would be his ancestry to the gods. His forename Gaius was the most common name in Rome, an equivalent to Joe or John, for example. He would never be addressed by this in public, except perhaps by his closest of friends. Now, his third name, Caesar, in some accounts, means hairy, Could have been a joke or a nickname he acquired throughout the course of his life. It was his most distinctive of his names and became the name by which he was most commonly known. Marcus Tullius Cicero, great orator and lawyer. Cicero, for example, means chickpea, and Cincinnatus actually means curly. So again, those are nicknames. The only people in Rome who had personal names were slaves, and were named by their masters like pets. This also applied to very low-born Romans and immigrants who had no lineage that was of any importance in Roman society. Now, a few remarks on Polybius on Roman worship of their ancestors. The law of the 12 tables forbade excessive display at funerals, especially displays of wealth or grief by women. Funerals are supposed to be displays of family piety. And Polybius states that when a man dies, his son, or if they are of age, or another close relative, if they are not, delivers an address which recounts the virtues and successes achieved by the dead man during his lifetime. By these means, the whole populace are involved in the ceremony as the dead man's career is recalled. These sympathies, the sympathies of those in attendance are deeply engaged. The loss is a public loss, which affects the whole people. The image of the dead man would be placed in a conspicuous position in the household, where it is enclosed in a wooden shrine. And when a distinguished member of the family dies, the masks are taken from the home to the funeral and are worn by men who are considered to bear the closest family resemblance in both height and appearance. According to Polybius, this is a great way for a young man to win fame and practice virtue at the same time in Roman society at a funeral, by donning these funerary masks. For more than 2 centuries after the founding of the Republic, warfare and agriculture were the chief occupations of most Romans. There's no standard system of coinage until 289 BCE, which would suggest perhaps that commerce may not have been the most significant economic component in this time period. Once Romans really began to look at expansion beyond Italy, things would begin to change rapidly. In 265 BCE, they completed their absorption of Etruscan territory and controlled most of the peninsula. A year later, they would be embroiled in a war overseas as they began to make the slow but steady transition from a republic into an empire. Now, lastly, I want to make a few remarks on patronage. Roman society and patronage within Roman society is something that we need to talk about. So Roman society is modeled on the hierarchy of the Roman family, and patronage is another one of those examples. Now, especially the example of the relationship between patrons and clients. A patron, derived from patre or father, means defender or protector, and a client would mean dependent. All right, now here's some examples of patron-client relationship. A peasant is in need of help on his farm. He might ask a wealthy neighbor to become his patron. A freed slave might become the client of his former owner. A conquered foe may become the client of the victorious general. Patrons and clients helped each other in a variety of ways. In return for a favor of some kind, a client would owe his patron his vote, his presence in public on important occasions, and things of that nature. Okay, so guys, what we're going to be doing after this is I'll be uploading some lectures on the Middle and Late Republic, and be going into great detail on the Punic Wars and the Roman Empire. So you guys get ready for the transition from republic to empire, be reading along in your textbook, follow along with the audiobook, and check out some of the sources that I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture. That's going to be it for today. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you all very soon.